They called him the Duke who refused England. Not because he lacked beauty. Not because he lacked wealth. And certainly not because he lacked opportunity. Nathaniel Blackthorne, Duke of Raven-shire, possessed everything that ambitious mothers prayed for and everything ambitious daughters dreamed about. Yet for 8 long years, he had turned away every suitable bride presented before him. By the winter of 1862, the mystery had become one of London's favourite obsessions. On a bitter January evening, the chandeliers of Ashcombe House blazed like captured stars above a sea of silk and diamonds. Laughter drifted through the ballroom. The orchestra played a lively waltz. Crystal glasses glittered beneath candlelight. Every inch of the magnificent room reflected wealth, power, and expectation. At the centre of it all stood Lady Victoria Ashcroft. At 26, she was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in England. Her golden hair shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her emerald gown had been imported from Paris. Her smile had reduced more than one young gentleman to complete foolishness. Tonight, she had every reason to be confident. The Duke of Raven-shire had accepted an invitation to attend. That fact alone had sent half the unmarried women in London into a frenzy. For months, rumours had circulated through drawing rooms, opera houses, and private clubs. Perhaps the Duke was finally prepared to choose a wife. Perhaps the years of refusal were ending. Perhaps this season would belong to one fortunate woman. Victoria fully intended that woman to be herself. She adjusted a diamond bracelet at her wrist and glanced toward the ballroom entrance for what felt like the 20th time. Nearby, her mother lowered her voice. "You must remain calm." Victoria smiled. "I am perfectly calm." Lady Ashcroft raised an eyebrow. "You have looked at that doorway every 3 minutes." "Only because everyone else is." Her mother followed her gaze. The grand entrance remained empty. "If he comes." Victoria's smile tightened. "He'll come." Across the room, similar conversations unfolded. Mothers whispered strategy. Daughters practiced charming expressions. Older ladies exchanged predictions. Even gentlemen seemed unusually alert. The Duke's appearance always altered the atmosphere of a gathering. It was impossible not to notice when one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England entered a room. A sudden hush swept across the ballroom. Conversations faltered. The orchestra stumbled for a brief second before recovering. Heads turned toward the entrance. The butler's voice carried clearly through the silence. "His Grace, the Duke of Raven-shire." Every eye shifted toward the doorway. Nathaniel Blackthorne entered without hurry. He was 36 years old. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Impeccably dressed in black evening attire that emphasized the strength of his frame. His dark hair was touched with the faintest trace of silver near the temples. His expression revealed nothing. Yet there was something about him that drew attention immediately. Perhaps it was confidence. Perhaps it was authority. Or perhaps it was the strange distance he carried around himself like an invisible wall. People moved aside without being asked. They always did. Nathaniel acknowledged greetings with brief nods. Nothing more. No lingering conversations. No flirtation. No encouragement. He moved through the crowd with the calm precision of a man entirely immune to society's expectations. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. "Now," her mother whispered. "Go." Victoria gathered her courage and stepped forward. Several young ladies watched with poorly concealed envy. After all, if anyone stood a chance, it was Lady Victoria Ashcroft. She was beautiful. Well-connected. Wealthy. Perfectly suitable. Nathaniel stopped as she approached. "Your Grace." Victoria offered a graceful curtsy. "Lady Victoria." His voice was deep and controlled. "You honor us with your presence tonight." "I accepted an invitation." His response was polite. "Nothing more." Victoria forced a smile. "I was hoping you might reserve a dance for me." Around them, people pretended not to listen. They listened anyway. Nathaniel regarded her for a moment. His expression remained unreadable. I do not dance, Lady Victoria. A faint ripple moved through the nearby crowd. Victoria's cheeks warmed. Not at all. Not at all. The answer arrived without hesitation. For one painful second, silence stretched between them. Then Nathaniel inclined his head. Please excuse me. He stepped around her and continued across the ballroom. The rejection was flawless in its politeness, which somehow made it worse. Victoria remained frozen. Several ladies exchanged glances. One gentleman quickly looked away. Her mother appeared beside her moments later. You handled that well. Victoria laughed softly. The sound lacked warmth. Did I? Across the room, Nathaniel stood near a marble column. He accepted a glass of water from a passing servant. He neither noticed nor acknowledged the whispers beginning to spread through the ballroom. This was not the first rejection. It was merely the latest. And everyone knew it. 8 years. Dozens of introductions. Countless invitations. Every outcome remained the same. No courtship. No engagement. No wife. The mystery only grew. An elderly countess approached him later in the evening. Your Grace, forgive an old woman her curiosity. Nathaniel offered a faint smile. That depends on the curiosity. The countess laughed. People are beginning to wonder if you intend to remain a bachelor forever. People have remarkable imaginations. That is not an answer. It was not intended to be. The countess studied him carefully. You disappoint many hopeful mothers. Then I fear I shall continue disappointing them. The older woman chuckled despite herself. One day, Your Grace, someone may finally change your mind. For the first time that evening, something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. It lasted less than a second. A flicker. A shadow. Then it vanished. I sincerely doubt it. The countess noticed. Most people would not have. But she had lived long enough to recognize old sorrow when she saw it. Nathaniel moved away before she could continue. He crossed the ballroom and stepped through a set of glass doors leading onto a terrace. Cold air greeted him immediately. Snow dusted the gardens below. Moonlight silvered the distant trees. Behind him, music continued. Laughter drifted through the windows. Nathaniel welcomed the distance. The night air settled around him. Quiet. Familiar. Safe. He rested one gloved hand against the stone railing. For several moments, he simply watched the snow fall across the grounds. Few people understood that he preferred silence. Fewer still understood why. The ballroom behind him represented everything society expected. Marriage. Alliances. Appearances. Futures carefully arranged by other people. None of it held any appeal. Not anymore. A sudden memory threatened to surface. He pushed it away before it fully formed. The habit had become second nature. 8 years provided ample practice. Footsteps approached from behind. Nathaniel recognized them before he turned. Mother. Dowager Duchess Margaret Blackthorne stepped onto the terrace wrapped in a dark velvet cloak. Her silver hair gleamed beneath the lantern light. At 62, she possessed the same commanding presence that had once intimidated half the aristocracy. It still intimidated some of them. You escaped. Nathaniel's mouth twitched slightly. So did you? I only followed you. She joined him at the railing. For a moment, neither spoke. The Dowager Duchess watched the snowfall. Then she sighed. You rejected Lady Victoria. I did. Before that, Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Yes. Before that, Lady Catherine Beaumont. Nathaniel glanced at her. Are we reviewing the entire list? It is becoming rather lengthy. Despite himself, he almost smiled. Margaret studied her son carefully. Concern softened her features. Nathaniel. He already knew the conversation that would follow. They had repeated versions of it for years. Mother. You cannot spend the rest of your life alone. He looked back toward the gardens. Why not? The question caught her off guard. Because people need companionship. Do they? Most do. Nathaniel remained silent. Margaret's expression grew gentler. You are not the same man you were before. The words hung between them. Dangerous words. Neither specified before what. Neither needed to. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. 8 years is a long time. Not long enough to erase grief. He looked away. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness. For a moment, he seemed older than 36. Much older. Margaret wished she could reach him. She wished she knew how. The son who once laughed easily had become increasingly difficult to find. He still fulfilled every duty. He managed vast estates. Protected tenants. Conducted business with remarkable skill. He remained respected throughout England. Yet part of him existed elsewhere. Locked behind walls nobody could enter. There was a time, Margaret said quietly, when you believed in happiness. Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on the falling snow. There was a time when many things were different. Neither spoke again for several moments. Eventually, music drifted from the ballroom once more. A new waltz had begun. Couples moved across polished floors beneath golden light. Dreams continued. Ambitions continued. Society continued. As it always did. Nathaniel straightened. I should leave. Margaret sighed. Of course. He offered his arm. She accepted it. Together they returned through the ballroom. Conversations immediately resumed around them. Curious eyes followed their progress. Speculation blossomed wherever they passed. Nathaniel ignored it all. Yet as he crossed the room, one young debutante whispered to another. The words barely reached him. Why does he always look so sad? Her friend answered softly. Perhaps because he has everything except the one thing he wants. Nathaniel continued walking without reacting. But somewhere deep beneath years of discipline, the words struck closer than either young woman could have imagined. Outside, snow continued to fall across England. Across great estates and humble cottages. Across London townhouses and distant villages. Across lives separated by wealth, status, and circumstance. In a small Yorkshire town nearly 200 miles away, a young woman sat beside a window with a needle in her hand, completely unaware that the most powerful bachelor in England had just taken the first step toward changing her life forever. Morning arrived quietly in Yorkshire. Snow still lingered along the edges of stone walls and cottage roofs, though the worst of winter had begun to loosen its grip on the countryside. The town of Whitmore Hollow woke slowly beneath a pale grey sky. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. Bakers carried fresh loaves into display windows. Horses pulled wagons through narrow streets still damp from yesterday's melting frost. At the corner of Market Lane stood Bennett and Finch Dressmaking. The modest shop occupied the first floor of a narrow brick building with ivy climbing one side and flower boxes waiting patiently for spring. The sign above the entrance had faded with age, but the business inside remained surprisingly successful. Customers came from neighboring villages. Some traveled nearly 30 miles for fittings. Others arrived simply because they had heard stories about the young seamstress whose hand seemed capable of miracles. Inside the workshop, Clara Bennett sat beside a window she could not see. Morning sunlight filtered through the glass and warmed her face. Her fingers moved steadily across a length of pale blue silk. A needle flashed between skilled hands. Tiny stitches appeared with remarkable precision. Anyone watching would have struggled to believe she had been blind since childhood. The fabric rested beneath her fingertips like a familiar language. She knew every texture, every thread, every slight imperfection hidden within expensive cloth. Her world existed through touch, sound, scent, and memory. While others relied on sight, Clara relied on attention. She listened more carefully, felt more deeply. Not because she wished to, because she had learned long ago that survival depended upon it. A bell jingled near the shop entrance. Clara smiled without looking up. "Mrs. Donnelly," she said. "You are early today." A surprised laugh followed. "How did you know it was me?" Clara tied off a stitch. "You always carry lavender sachets in your coat pockets." Mrs. Donnelly chuckled. "One day you will reveal your secrets and ruin the mystery." Clara rose from her chair. At 25, she moved confidently through the workshop. Her dark brown hair had been gathered into a simple knot. Her dress was plain but neat. There was nothing particularly fashionable about her appearance. Nothing designed to attract attention. Yet people often found themselves drawn to her anyway. Perhaps it was her calm voice. Perhaps it was her quiet confidence. Or perhaps it was the rare feeling that Clara truly listened whenever someone spoke. Mrs. Donnelly set a package on the work table. "The alterations are perfect." "I am glad." "My daughter looked beautiful at her engagement dinner." Clara's smile softened. "That is wonderful news." She asked whether you might make her wedding gown. Clara paused. "That is quite an honor. I told her there is no one better." Warmth touched Clara's expression. Compliments still embarrassed her. They always had. Mrs. Donnelly lowered her voice. "You should charge more for your work." Clara laughed softly. "Everyone says that." "Because it is true." "Then perhaps everyone should stop saying it." The older woman shook her head affectionately. "You are impossible." After Mrs. Donnelly left, another customer arrived. Then another. The morning passed quickly. Measuring. Sewing. Adjusting. Listening. The small workshop hummed with activity. By noon, Clara's grandmother emerged from the rear rooms carrying a tray of tea and fresh bread. Eleanor Bennett was 70 years old and possessed the practical wisdom of someone who had survived nearly everything life could offer. She placed a cup beside Clara. "You have not stopped working all morning." Clara accepted the tea. "Neither have you." "I am old enough to ignore my own advice." Clara smiled. "You tell me that every week." Eleanor settled into a nearby chair. "And one day you may finally listen." Clara reached for the bread. The scent alone made her realize how hungry she had become. For several minutes they enjoyed a comfortable silence. The kind shared only by people who know each other completely. Then Eleanor spoke. "You received another letter yesterday." Clara groaned. "Please tell me it was not Mr. Harper." "It was Mr. Harper." Clara leaned back dramatically. "The poor man refuses to surrender." Eleanor laughed. "He owns half the flour mills in the county. Then he should devote his attention to flour." "He wishes to devote his attention to you." Clara shook her head. "No. You have not even considered him." "I have." For approximately 3 seconds. Clara bit into a piece of bread. "For seconds." Eleanor sighed. "You cannot avoid every opportunity forever." Clara's smile faded slightly. She lowered her cup onto the table. "Grandmother." Eleanor immediately regretted pushing. She knew this conversation. They had traveled its path many times before. Clara folded her hands together. "Most men do not truly want me." "That is not true." "Some pity me." Her voice remained gentle. "Some admire the idea of being kind. Others imagine they can rescue me." She shook her head. "I do not wish to be rescued." Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "No. You never have." Clara smiled faintly. "I only want honesty." "That is not too much to ask." "Sometimes it feels like it is." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter with familiar concern. Clara rarely complained, rarely sought sympathy. Yet loneliness occasionally slipped through the cracks. Not because she lacked friends. Not because she lacked purpose. Because everyone desired connection. Even those who pretended otherwise. A sharp knock interrupted the conversation. Eleanor rose to answer the door. Moments later, unfamiliar footsteps entered the workshop. Clara immediately recognized the difference. Not local. Not ordinary. The visitor moved with confidence. Expensive leather boots. Fine wool coat. A faint scent of cedar and expensive soap. Male. Well-educated. Wealthy. Clara tilted her head slightly. Good afternoon. The man paused. Miss Bennett. Yes. My name is Arthur Graves. His voice carried polished London refinement. I represent a client who wishes to commission your services. Clara exchanged a glance she could not see with her grandmother, though years together allowed them to communicate anyway. What sort of commission? Arthur removed papers from a leather case. Several garments. For whom? A brief hesitation followed. Clara noticed immediately. My client prefers discretion. Eleanor folded her arms. That sounds suspicious. Arthur smiled politely. I assure you it is not. Clara considered. If I am expected to create clothing, I must know something about the person wearing it. Naturally. Arthur relaxed slightly. The garments are intended for a lady. A wedding. Arthur hesitated again. Clara noticed. Perhaps. She smiled faintly. You do not sound certain. The circumstances are unusual. How unusual? Arthur exhaled. The order comes from Raven-shire Hall. Silence settled across the workshop. Even Eleanor stopped moving. Clara recognized the name. Everyone did. Raven-shire Hall ranked among the grandest estates in England. Stories about its wealth reached even small Yorkshire towns. That is a considerable distance. Approximately 180 miles. And your client wishes me to travel there? Yes. Clara sat quietly. The room seemed strangely still. Arthur continued. The commission would include transportation, lodging, and compensation well beyond standard rates. Eleanor recovered first. Why Clara? Arthur smiled. Because my employer requested the finest seamstress available. Clara laughed softly. Someone exaggerated terribly. On the contrary. Arthur's tone remained sincere. Your reputation preceded you. Clara lowered her gaze. Compliments always made her uncomfortable. Who is the lady? Arthur carefully folded his gloves. I cannot answer that. Why not? Because I genuinely do not know. That surprised both women. Clara frowned slightly. You are arranging gowns for an unknown bride. I warned you the circumstances were unusual. Clara considered everything she had heard. A wealthy estate. A mysterious commission. Wedding garments for a woman nobody seemed willing to identify. Curiosity stirred despite her caution. Arthur reached into his case again and produced a sealed envelope. There is also an advance payment. Eleanor accepted it. A startled silence followed almost immediately. Clara recognized the reaction. Grandmother. Eleanor sounded faintly stunned. Good heavens. Arthur cleared his throat. My employer prefers quality. Clara smiled. That much is obvious. The workshop fell quiet again. Outside, distant church bells marked the passing hour. Somewhere a wagon rolled across cobblestones. Life continued normally. Yet Clara sensed something shifting. Not around her. Around the future itself. The feeling made little sense. Still, it lingered. Arthur waited patiently. Finally Clara spoke. How soon would I need to leave? Within 3 days. Eleanor looked alarmed. 3 days. The schedule is unfortunately fixed. Clara traced one finger across the tabletop while she thought. Opportunity rarely arrived disguised as certainty. More often it arrived wrapped in questions. This commission contained many questions. Perhaps too many. Yet something about it felt impossible to ignore. She lifted her head. I will go. Arthur visibly relaxed. Excellent. Eleanor stared at her granddaughter. That was fast. Clara smiled. You told me not to avoid opportunities. I did not expect you to listen. Arthur laughed. The sound eased some of the tension in the room. He gathered his documents and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused. One final thing. Clara turned toward his voice. Yes? My employer requested that I mention something specifically. What? Arthur glanced between the two women. When you arrive at Raven-shire Hall, you may hear rumors. Clara smiled. About what? About marriages. That seems likely. Do not believe everything you hear. Clara's expression sharpened slightly. What exactly does that mean? Arthur opened the door. Cold winter air drifted inside. I wish I knew, Miss Bennett. Then he stepped outside and disappeared into the afternoon. The bell above the entrance jingled softly behind him. Clara remained where she stood. The strange feeling returned. Stronger this time. Raven-shire Hall. A mysterious bride. A commission surrounded by secrets. Somewhere far to the south, beyond snow-covered fields and crowded cities, an enormous estate waited. And for reasons she could not explain, Clara suddenly felt as though her life had already begun moving toward it. 3 days later, before dawn had fully broken across the Yorkshire countryside, Clara Bennett stood beside a waiting carriage wrapped in her warmest wool cloak. The winter air carried a sharp chill that nipped at her cheeks and slipped beneath her gloves. Nearby, Eleanor Bennett fussed over details for the 10th time. You packed the extra needles? Yes, grandmother. The silver scissors? Yes. The pattern books? Clara smiled. You checked them yourself? Eleanor sighed. That does not mean I stopped worrying. Clara reached for her grandmother's hands. I will be fine. You are traveling nearly 200 miles with strangers. Respectable strangers. Still strangers. Arthur Graves stood patiently beside the carriage, wisely avoiding the conversation. The horses shifted in their harnesses. A driver cleared his throat politely. Time was slipping away. Clara squeezed her grandmother's fingers. I will write. Every week. Every week. Promise. I promise. Eleanor pulled her into a tight embrace. For a brief moment neither spoke. Clara knew what worried her grandmother most. Not the journey. Not the unfamiliar estate. It was change itself. For 25 years Clara's world had remained largely within reach of Whitmore Hollow. This commission represented something different. Something larger. Something unknown. Finally Eleanor stepped back. Go before I change my mind. Clara laughed softly. Arthur opened the carriage door. We should arrive at Raven-shire Hall tomorrow afternoon if the roads remain clear. Clara climbed aboard. The carriage lurched forward moments later. As the wheels rolled away from Market Lane, she listened to the sounds she knew so well. Familiar voices. Church bells. Shop doors opening. The distant barking of a dog. One by one they faded behind her. By the time evening arrived, Yorkshire had become memory. The journey stretched across 2 long days. Clara spent much of it listening. She listened to the rhythm of the horses. To the changing accents at coaching inns. To the subtle differences between towns. England revealed itself through sound. In one village she heard fishermen unloading their catch before sunrise. In another she heard factory whistles echoing through cold morning air. Near London the roads grew busier. More carriages. More voices. More movement. Arthur proved pleasant company. He spoke when necessary and remained silent when appropriate. Clara appreciated both qualities. By the second afternoon, they had travelled through rolling countryside bordered by ancient stone walls and sleeping winter fields. The carriage finally slowed. Arthur glanced out the window. "We are nearly there." Clara straightened. Excitement and nervousness twisted together inside her chest. She had imagined Raven-shire Hall dozens of times during the journey. Each version differed from the last. None would likely resemble reality. The carriage continued forward. Gravel crunched beneath the wheels. Large iron gates opened somewhere ahead. Clara heard them. Massive. Heavy. Expensive. Arthur's voice carried a note of amusement. Most visitors stare at the gates. Clara smiled. Describe them. Tall enough to impress kings. That sounds excessive. It probably is. The carriage continued onward. A long drive stretched ahead. Clara sensed the change immediately. The sounds felt more open. Wider. Vast ground surrounded them. Arthur noticed her expression. "How can you tell?" The air changed. He blinked. The air. There are fewer buildings. More space. Arthur looked outside. Endless parkland unfolded around them. Remarkable. Clara smiled but said nothing. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the carriage finally approached the main house. Arthur stepped down first when they stopped. Servants appeared almost immediately. Voices echoed across a large stone courtyard. Clara accepted Arthur's hand and descended carefully. The moment her boots touched the ground, she understood one thing immediately. Raven-shire Hall was enormous. Sound behaved differently around large buildings. Voices travelled farther. Footsteps lingered. Wind shifted along stone walls. The estate seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. A woman approached. Her footsteps were confident and efficient. "Miss Bennett." "Yes." "Welcome to Raven-shire Hall." Her voice carried warmth. "I am Mrs. Fairchild, the housekeeper." Clara smiled. "Thank you. We are delighted you arrived safely." Arthur transferred luggage to waiting servants. Mrs. Fairchild gently offered her arm. "Allow me to show you inside." Clara accepted. Warmth surrounded her almost immediately as they entered. Fires crackled somewhere nearby. Polished floors reflected footsteps. The faint scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and fresh flowers filled the air. "Goodness," Clara murmured. Mrs. Fairchild laughed softly. "That was my reaction when I first arrived 20 years ago." They moved through what felt like an enormous entrance hall. Clara listened carefully. A grand staircase rose nearby. Several corridors branched away in different directions. Servants moved quietly but efficiently. The entire house operated like a small village. The estate employs over 40 indoor staff, Mrs. Fairchild explained. Clara nearly stopped walking. 40. Not including groundskeepers. Clara shook her head in disbelief. That is larger than some towns. Mrs. Fairchild smiled. You are not entirely wrong. They eventually reached a comfortable suite of rooms prepared specifically for Clara. The accommodations were more luxurious than anything she had experienced before. Thick carpet softened every footstep. A fire burned steadily in the sitting room. Fresh flowers scented the air. Clara touched the edge of a chair. Fine craftsmanship. Expensive wood. Elegant upholstery. Everything felt carefully chosen. This cannot possibly be necessary. Mrs. Fairchild sounded amused. At Raven-shire Hall, it is considered modest. Clara laughed. Then I fear your standards are dangerous. After Arthur departed and the luggage was unpacked, Clara spent the remainder of the afternoon settling into unfamiliar surroundings. Several servants introduced themselves. Everyone treated her with unexpected kindness. Yet something continued to bother her. The commission itself. By evening she finally asked the question occupying her thoughts since Yorkshire. Mrs. Fairchild was serving tea when Clara spoke. "May I ask something?" "Of course." "Who is the bride?" Silence followed. Not long. But long enough. Clara noticed immediately. That is an interesting question. It seems like an important one. Mrs. Fairchild set down a teacup. You would think so. Clara tilted her head. What does that mean? Another pause. Then the housekeeper sighed. Miss Bennett, how much have they told you? Almost nothing. That explains a great deal. Clara smiled faintly. Does it? Mrs. Fairchild lowered her voice. There is no bride. Clara blinked. I beg your pardon. There is no bride. Clara sat perfectly still. Then why am I here? That is a question half the household asks every day. Confusion flooded through her. I do not understand. Neither do we. Clara stared toward the sound of Mrs. Fairchild's voice. You ordered wedding gowns. Several. For whom? Mrs. Fairchild hesitated. No one knows. Clara laughed once. It sounded almost disbelieving. That is impossible. One would think. Someone must know. Perhaps. The housekeeper's tone shifted slightly. If anyone does, they are not speaking. Clara considered everything she had heard. The mystery suddenly felt larger than before. Much larger. Is there an engagement? No. A wedding planned? No. A bride selected? Not that we know. Clara rubbed her forehead. Then why commission wedding gowns? Mrs. Fairchild lowered her voice even further. Because the order came directly from the Dowager Duchess. Clara absorbed that information slowly. The Duke's mother. Yes. And the Duke approved. Mrs. Fairchild laughed unexpectedly. The Duke approves very little where marriage is concerned. Curiosity sharpened. Why? The housekeeper hesitated. You truly have not heard. Heard what? Mrs. Fairchild settled into a chair opposite her. Miss Bennett, the Duke has refused every suitable bride presented to him for nearly 8 years. Clara remembered whispers from Yorkshire. Fragments of gossip overheard in markets and coaching inns. She had paid little attention at the time. Every bride? Every one. Why? No one knows. Silence settled between them. Firelight crackled nearby. Somewhere outside, wind brushed against the windows. Clara felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not concern. Curiosity. The kind that lingered. The kind that refused to leave. That sounds lonely. Mrs. Fairchild seemed surprised. Most people say it sounds foolish. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Loneliness and foolishness often travel together. The housekeeper regarded her thoughtfully. You are not quite what I expected. Clara smiled. Neither is this house. A knock sounded at the door. A young maid entered moments later. Mrs. Fairchild. Yes? The Dowager Duchess has returned from London. Clara immediately sensed the subtle shift in the room. Servants respected power. This message carried power. Mrs. Fairchild rose. Thank you. The maid departed. Clara listened as footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she turned toward the housekeeper. Will I meet her? Undoubtedly. Soon? Mrs. Fairchild smiled. At Raven-shire Hall, when the Dowager Duchess wishes to meet someone, it usually happens very quickly. Clara laughed softly. That sounds ominous. Perhaps a little. Outside her suite, the vast estate continued its evening routine. Servants prepared dinner. Footmen moved through hallways. Fires were tended. Lamps were lit. Somewhere within the enormous house, the woman responsible for this mysterious commission had just arrived home. And for reasons Clara could not explain, she suddenly felt certain that her true purpose at Raven-shire Hall had nothing to do with wedding gowns at all. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pearl. Winter sunlight filtered through tall windows and spread across Raven-shire Hall in pale ribbons of gold. Clara woke early, long before most guests in a house of this size would have considered leaving their beds. Years of work had trained her body to greet the day before dawn. She dressed carefully, braided her hair, and prepared herself for whatever awaited beyond her suite. A maid named Emily arrived shortly after breakfast. "Mrs. Fairchild asked me to show you the workroom, Miss Bennett." Clara smiled. "I would appreciate that." Emily offered her arm. Together they stepped into the corridor. The house felt different in daylight. More alive. Servants moved through hallways carrying trays, ledgers, and baskets of fresh linens. Somewhere nearby a clock chimed the quarter hour. Footsteps echoed from distant staircases. Voices drifted through open doorways. Clara absorbed everything. She always did. "Have you worked here long?" she asked. "Nearly 4 years." Emily sounded pleased by the question. "My father manages one of the tenant farms." "Then this estate has been part of your life for a long time." "Most of my life." Clara smiled. "You sound fond of it." "I am." Emily hesitated. "Most of us are." Clara noticed the pause. "Most." The young maid lowered her voice. Things became quieter after. She stopped herself. "After what?" "Nothing important." Clara sensed there was more. Much more. But she let the subject pass. People revealed themselves in their own time. They eventually reached a spacious workroom overlooking part of the estate grounds. Large tables occupied the center. Shelves lined the walls. Bolts of fabric stood neatly arranged by color and texture. Clara ran her fingers lightly across several pieces. Silk. Velvet. Satin. Lace. Materials worth small fortunes. "Good heavens," she murmured. Emily laughed softly. "That was my reaction too." Clara moved slowly through the room. Every surface reflected careful organization. Whoever maintained this space valued precision. "This is remarkable." The Dowager Duchess insisted everything be prepared before your arrival. Clara paused. "Personally?" "Yes." That answer only deepened the mystery. Before Clara could ask another question, footsteps approached from the hallway. Not hurried. Not uncertain. Deliberate. Confident. A woman entered. Clara immediately straightened. The room itself seemed to react. Emily curtsied. "Your Grace." Margaret Blackthorne crossed the threshold with effortless authority. She carried herself like someone who had spent decades commanding respect and rarely encountered resistance. Yet warmth softened her presence. "Miss Bennett." Clara curtsied respectfully. "Your Grace." Margaret studied her for several moments. Clara felt the weight of that attention. Not uncomfortable. Merely thorough. Like someone evaluating a puzzle. Then the Dowager Duchess smiled. "I am pleased you accepted my invitation. Your generosity has already exceeded anything I expected." Margaret laughed lightly. An answer both polite and diplomatic. "My grandmother claims those qualities occasionally save me from trouble." Wise woman. Clara immediately liked her. Margaret possessed the confidence of great rank without the cruelty that sometimes accompanied it. They spoke for nearly half an hour. About Yorkshire. About dressmaking. About Clara's grandmother. About the challenges of managing a household. Yet throughout the conversation, Clara sensed something beneath the surface. A purpose not yet revealed. Finally she decided to ask directly. "Your Grace, may I inquire about the gowns?" Margaret's smile flickered. "You may. Mrs. Fairchild informed me there is no bride." The Dowager Duchess sighed. "Mrs. Fairchild rarely misses anything." "Is she correct?" "Entirely." Clara folded her hands. "Then why am I here?" Margaret looked toward the window. For a brief moment she seemed older. More tired. Because sometimes solutions arrive from unexpected places. Clara frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "Neither do I yet." The honesty surprised her. Margaret rose from her chair. "Come. Let us walk." Emily remained behind as the two women left the workroom. Clara accepted the Dowager Duchess's arm. Together they moved through corridors lined with portraits and polished wood. "Have you ever met someone who appeared impossible to help?" Margaret asked. Clara considered. "Yes." "And yet you wanted to try anyway?" "Also yes." Margaret nodded. "Then perhaps you understand more than you realize." Clara listened carefully. "You are speaking about someone specific." "I am." They continued walking. The house seemed endless. Corridors connected to galleries. Galleries opened into sitting rooms. Staircases curved toward upper floors. Clara maintained her orientation through memory and sound. Eventually they reached a quieter section of the house. Fewer servants. Less activity. The atmosphere changed. Margaret slowed slightly. "My son lives mostly in this wing when he is home." Clara immediately understood. "The Duke? Does he spend much time here?" "More than he should." A trace of sadness entered Margaret's voice. "And less than he once did." Before Clara could respond, a servant approached from the opposite direction. "Your Grace." "Yes?" "The estate reports from Hampshire have arrived." Margaret accepted a bundle of papers. "Thank you." The servant departed. Clara waited politely. Margaret glanced down at the documents. "I must review these." "Of course. The library is directly ahead." She touched Clara's arm lightly. "You are welcome to explore." Clara smiled. "As long as I do not become lost." "If you do, half the household will be searching within minutes." The Dowager Duchess squeezed her hand affectionately before leaving. Clara remained where she stood for a moment. Silence settled around her. Not complete silence. Houses this large never truly slept. Yet this section felt different. More private. More reserved. Slowly she began moving forward. The corridor stretched ahead. Thick carpet softened her footsteps. Somewhere nearby a fire crackled. She followed the sound. The library proved easy to identify. The scent reached her first. Leather bindings. Old paper. Polished wood. Centuries of collected knowledge. Clara smiled. Libraries always felt welcoming. She stepped inside. The room was vast. She could hear the dimensions immediately. High ceilings. Tall shelves. Large windows. She moved carefully along one wall, trailing her fingertips lightly across carved wood panels. Every now and then she paused to examine a book. Not by reading the title. By touching the binding. Some were worn from decades of use. Others remained almost untouched. She wandered deeper into the room. The quiet soothed her. Minutes passed. Perhaps longer. Then she heard another sound. Footsteps. A man's footsteps. Strong. Measured. approaching from somewhere ahead. Clara immediately stopped. "I apologize," she said. "I did not realize anyone else was here." The footsteps halted. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Merely unexpected. Clara waited. Finally a deep voice answered. "You are not disturbing anything." The sound startled her. Not because it was harsh. Because it carried a weight she had not anticipated. Controlled. Reserved. Familiar with command. She smiled politely. "Then I am relieved." The man did not immediately respond. Clara sensed his attention settling on her. Curious. Assessing. Much like Margaret's earlier examination. "You are Miss Bennett." The statement caught her off guard. "Yes. The seamstress from Yorkshire. I did not realize my arrival had become common knowledge." A faint pause. Then, unexpectedly, the slightest hint of amusement entered his voice. "In this house, very little remains secret." Clara laughed softly. "I am beginning to notice." The silence that followed felt different. Less formal somehow. She took another cautious step forward. Unfortunately, the library contained more furniture than she realized. Her knee struck the corner of a low table. The impact was minor but unexpected. She lost balance. A startled breath escaped her. Instantly movement crossed the room. Strong hands caught her before she could fall. One hand steadied her arm. The other settled lightly against her shoulder. Clara froze. So did the man. For one suspended second neither moved. Then something happened. Her gloved fingertips brushed exposed skin near his neck. Not intentionally. Merely an accident created by proximity. Yet the moment contact occurred, she felt it. A narrow ridge hidden beneath the edge of his collar. A scar. Old. Smooth. Distinct. The reaction was immediate. The man's body went completely still. Not with anger. Not exactly. More like shock. Clara pulled her hand back at once. "I am so sorry." Silence answered her. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Embarrassment flooded her face. "I did not mean to." She hesitated. "Forgive me." Still no response. Clara's heart began beating faster. Had she offended him? Injured him? Broken some unspoken rule? Then finally the deep voice returned. "Quieter now. You do not need to apologize." Clara blinked. That was not the reaction she expected. "Are you certain?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes." The answer sounded almost distant. As though the speaker himself remained surprised. Clara slowly straightened. The man's hand left her shoulder. Yet neither stepped away. Neither seemed quite certain what to do next. Somewhere in the distance a clock chimed. The sound echoed faintly through the enormous house. Clara forced a small smile. "I appear to have made a poor first impression." "On the contrary." The words arrived before he seemed to think about them. A strange silence followed. Then he added more carefully, "Most visitors do not wander through the library alone." Clara laughed softly. "Most visitors can see where they are going." Again she heard that faint trace of amusement. Brief. Fleeting. Real. That is a fair point. Something about the exchange eased the tension. Clara relaxed slightly. "May I ask your name?" The question hung between them. Then the man answered. "Nathaniel." The name settled into place instantly. Clara's breath caught. Not because she recognized the voice. Because there was only one Nathaniel in Raven-shire Hall whose first name required no explanation. The realization arrived a heartbeat later. She had just touched the Duke of Raven-shire. And for reasons she could not begin to understand, he did not sound angry at all. For several seconds, neither spoke. The vast library seemed to shrink around the unexpected encounter. Clara became acutely aware of every detail she could perceive. The steady crackle of the fire. The faint scent of leather-bound books. The quiet rhythm of the Duke's breathing only a few feet away. Nathaniel Blackthorne. The name carried weight throughout England. Even in Yorkshire, people spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Yet standing here, he sounded nothing like the distant figure described in newspapers and drawing rooms. He sounded tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper than that. Clara recovered first. "Your Grace." Nathaniel's voice remained calm. "Miss Bennett." She smiled faintly. "I suspect that introduction should have happened sooner." "Perhaps." The brief reply carried the same reserved quality she had noticed moments earlier. Not cold. Simply cautious. Clara shifted her weight. "Then I should properly apologize again." "For what?" "Touching a complete stranger in a library." To her surprise, she heard a faint exhale that sounded remarkably close to amusement. "You were falling." "A detail that does not improve my dignity." Another pause followed. Then Nathaniel said, "Your dignity appears intact." Clara laughed softly. The sound seemed to linger longer than expected in the quiet room. For reasons neither could explain, the tension eased. Not completely. Just enough. Nathaniel found himself studying her. He rarely studied anyone anymore. Most people approached him with predictable motives. Ambition. Curiosity. Calculation. Fear. Miss Bennett possessed none of those qualities. She had touched the scar without knowing it existed. Without recoiling. Without staring. Without asking questions. The realization unsettled him far more than it should have. 8 years. No one touched that scar. No one came close enough. Not intentionally. Not accidentally. The fact that he had not immediately stepped away remained deeply strange. Clara tilted her head slightly. "May I ask something?" Nathaniel should have declined. Instead he found himself saying, "You may." "Why does everyone in this house sound nervous when they mention you?" Silence settled briefly. Then Nathaniel replied, "That is a dangerous question. I was afraid of that. Perhaps because they work for me." Clara considered. "No." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "No? That is not what I hear." Genuine curiosity touched his expression. "And what do you hear?" Clara smiled. "Respect. Loyalty. Concern." The answer caught him off guard. Most people noticed power first. She had noticed something else entirely. "Concern," he repeated. "Especially concern." Nathaniel looked away toward the fire. "You draw conclusions quickly." "I listen carefully." "That sounds suspiciously similar." "My grandmother says the same thing." Another small silence followed. Yet unlike earlier silences, this one felt comfortable. Clara slowly moved toward a nearby chair. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "There is a chair to your left." "Thank you." She located it easily and sat down. "You know this room well." "I spend too much time here." Clara smiled. "There are worse habits." "Are there?" "Certainly." She folded her hands in her lap. "Books rarely break hearts." The words escaped before she could stop them. Instantly she regretted them. Nathaniel went completely still. Clara heard the shift immediately. Not through movement. Through absence of movement. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "That was overly personal." Nathaniel stared into the fire. Something painful flickered behind his eyes. "Gone almost immediately." "No." His voice remained steady. "It was merely unexpected." Clara sensed she had stumbled near something important. Something protected. She changed the subject at once. Your library is extraordinary. The transition was obvious. Nathaniel noticed and, unexpectedly, appreciated it. Most people pressed forward when they discovered a weakness. She retreated. My grandfather began the collection. How many books? Approximately 12,000. Clara laughed softly. That sounds excessive. It probably is. Have you read them all? No. Then there is still hope. Nathaniel found himself almost smiling again. Almost. The realization disturbed him. Very few conversations had reached this point in years. Even fewer had done so within minutes. A knock sounded at the library door. Both turned toward it instinctively. A footman entered. Your Grace. Nathaniel's expression immediately returned to its usual controlled form. Yes? The steward is waiting in your study. I will join him shortly. The servant bowed and departed. Silence returned. Clara rose slowly from her chair. I should not keep you from your responsibilities. Nathaniel should have agreed. Instead he asked, have you settled comfortably at the hall? Clara smiled. Everyone has been very kind. Good. Although I remain confused. About the gowns. About everything. Nathaniel could not argue with that. You are not alone. Clara laughed. That is a remarkably concerning answer. It is also an honest one. She studied the sound of his voice for a moment. Then something occurred to her. You know why I am here, do you not? Nathaniel hesitated. A subtle hesitation. Yet she noticed it instantly. I know why my mother invited you. Do you agree with her decision? A longer pause followed. Finally he answered truthfully. I do not know. Clara nodded slowly. Another honest answer. You seem surprised by honesty. Not surprised. Her smile softened. Only appreciative. Nathaniel found himself watching her again. There was no accusation in her words. No hidden agenda. Just sincerity. An increasingly rare quality. Miss Bennett. Yes? May I ask something? Of course. His gaze settled briefly on her face. When we met a few moments ago, how did you know there was a scar? Clara did not answer immediately. She considered the question carefully. Because scars feel different. Nathaniel remained silent. They carry stories, she continued. Most people think sight reveals everything. It does not. Her fingers lightly touched the arm of the chair. Hands notice things eyes sometimes miss. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. And what did you notice? Clara tilted her head. The question seemed to surprise her. Then she answered softly. Sadness. The single word settled heavily between them. Nathaniel looked away. Clara immediately wished she had remained silent. Yet the answer had come instinctively. Not from observation. From feeling. Several long seconds passed. Then Nathaniel spoke. You should be careful, Miss Bennett. His tone was gentle rather than critical. Why? People do not always appreciate being understood. Clara smiled sadly. Neither do lonely people. The words escaped before she could stop them. Again. Another accidental truth. This time neither apologized. Neither corrected it. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere outside the library, distant footsteps crossed a corridor. Life continued. Yet something had shifted. Neither fully understood it. Finally Clara stepped toward the doorway. Thank you for preventing a spectacular collision with the floor. Nathaniel inclined his head. You are welcome. And thank you for not dismissing me after I embarrassed myself. A faint shadow of amusement touched his expression. You assumed that was embarrassing. Was it not? No. Clara smiled. You are very generous. I have never been accused of that. Then perhaps people should pay closer attention. Before Nathaniel could respond, she turned and walked toward the door. Her steps remained careful but confident. He watched her leave. Something about that surprised him. He had spent years avoiding unnecessary attachments. Avoiding curiosity. Avoiding hope. Yet after the library door closed behind her, he remained where he stood. Thinking. Which irritated him immensely. Across the corridor, Clara followed a servant back toward her suite. Yet her own thoughts remained equally occupied. She had expected a cold aristocrat. A distant figure wrapped in titles and privilege. Instead, she had encountered a man carrying something heavy beneath remarkable self-control. The scar remained in her mind. Not because of its shape. Because of his reaction. People often revealed more through silence than conversation. By the time evening descended over Raven-shire Hall, both Nathaniel and Clara found themselves thinking about a conversation that should have ended the moment it began. Neither admitted it. Neither intended to repeat it. Yet somewhere inside the enormous house, a small and unexpected thread had already begun to form between them. Neither knew it yet. But for the first time in many years, Nathaniel Blackthorne found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The next morning, Raven-shire Hall awoke beneath a veil of drifting snow. During the night, a fresh layer had settled across the estate, transforming gardens, hedges, and distant fields into a landscape of silver and white. Clara stood beside the window in her sitting room, warming her hands around a cup of tea. She could not see the snowfall, yet she heard it in subtle ways. The world beyond the glass sounded softer. Quieter. Even the wind seemed gentler. A knock sounded at the door. Come in. Emily entered carrying a small tray. Good morning, Miss Bennett. Good morning. Mrs. Fairchild asked me to tell you that the Dowager Duchess will not require your company until after luncheon. Clara smiled. Then I have an entire morning to lose myself. Emily laughed. In this house, that is easier than you might think. After the maid departed, Clara decided to explore. She had spent the previous day learning only a fraction of Raven-shire Hall. The estate still felt like a puzzle waiting to be assembled. One room at a time. One corridor at a time. She wrapped herself in a warm cloak and stepped into the hallway. Her memory for spaces had always been unusually strong. By relying on sound, touch, and repetition, she built maps inside her mind. Already she could navigate several sections of the house without assistance. This morning she chose a different direction. The west wing. The corridor stretched quietly before her. Thick carpet softened every footstep. Occasionally a servant passed. Most greeted her warmly. Word of her presence had clearly spread throughout the household. Yet unlike the curiosity she often encountered elsewhere, the attention here felt genuine rather than intrusive. Halfway down a staircase, Clara heard voices below. Two maids were speaking in hushed tones. They fell silent the moment they noticed her approaching. Clara smiled. Please continue. I promise I am not royalty. One of the girls laughed nervously. Sorry, Miss Bennett. What were you discussing? Another brief silence followed. Clara immediately became suspicious. Now I am definitely curious. The younger maid lowered her voice. The Duke. Clara nearly smiled. Somehow she had expected that answer. What about him? The maids exchanged a glance. He smiled yesterday. Clara blinked. Surely that cannot be unusual. Both women stared. Miss Bennett. Yes? It is very unusual. Clara laughed softly. I find that difficult to believe. We have worked here 3 years. For years, corrected the other maid. For years. The first maid nodded. And we can count the number of smiles on one hand. Clara tried not to react. She remembered the brief traces of amusement in the library. Tiny moments. Fleeting enough to disappear if one blinked. Perhaps he was having a good day. The younger maid shook her head. People have been trying to give His Grace good days for years. Clara suddenly felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I should let you return to your duties. The maids curtsied and hurried away. Clara continued down the corridor. Yet their words lingered. He smiled yesterday. The observation should have meant nothing. Yet somehow it stayed with her. By late morning, Clara discovered a smaller library tucked away on the ground floor. Unlike the grand collection she had visited with Nathaniel, this room felt intimate. Comfortable. Sunlight warmed the space. Several chairs surrounded a fire. A piano occupied one corner. Clara immediately approved. She spent nearly an hour examining books and listening to the peaceful silence. Eventually another sound reached her. Footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Strong. Measured. Unhurried. Clara smiled before she could stop herself. Good morning, Your Grace. The footsteps paused. You recognized me. You sound disappointed. Merely curious. Clara tilted her head. I have learned that most people reveal themselves through how they walk. Nathaniel moved closer. And what do my footsteps reveal? That you spend too much time thinking. The answer arrived instantly. Nathaniel stared at her. Then, despite himself, he laughed. A genuine laugh. Short. Unexpected. Real. Clara froze. The sound transformed him completely. Warmer. Younger. Human in a way titles never allowed. Nathaniel seemed equally surprised. The laughter faded almost immediately. Yet not before both noticed it. Silence followed. Then Clara said softly, There it is. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. There what is? The smile everyone keeps talking about. To his astonishment, she laughed. Not at him. With him. The distinction mattered more than it should have. Nathaniel moved toward the fireplace. The staff gossip too much. The staff adore you. That seems unlikely. It is true. He studied her. How would you know? Clara settled into a chair. People sound different when they speak about someone they fear. Nathaniel remained silent. They worry about you. Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. Clara answered gently. Because you seem lonely. The room grew quiet. Firelight crackled softly. Nathaniel looked into the flames. No one said such things to him. Not anymore. Especially not with such simple honesty. You make remarkable observations. Occupational hazard. Of a seamstress? Clara smiled. Of a human being. Nathaniel shook his head slightly. You should not assume you understand people so easily. I do not. Her expression softened. But sometimes sadness sounds the same no matter who carries it. The words lingered. Nathaniel should have changed the subject. Instead he surprised himself. What about you? Clara blinked. What about me? Do you never feel lonely? For the first time since entering the room, she hesitated. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Clara looked down at her folded hands. Of course I do. Her voice remained calm. Yet something vulnerable touched the edges. Everyone does. Nathaniel waited. Something told him she was not finished. Most people assume blindness is the hardest part. She smiled faintly. It is not. No? Clara shook her head. The hardest part is watching people decide who you are before they know you. Nathaniel understood that feeling better than he wished. Because they pity you. Sometimes. Clara shrugged lightly. Sometimes they admire me. Sometimes they underestimate me. Sometimes they try to rescue me. Her smile became slightly crooked. Almost no one asks what I actually want. Nathaniel looked at her for several moments. What do you want? The question surprised her. Not because of the words. Because he genuinely wanted the answer. Clara sensed it immediately. A meaningful life. That seems reasonable. Someone who speaks honestly. Nathaniel almost smiled. That narrows the field considerably. Clara laughed. Exactly. Anything else? She thought for a moment. Peace. Nathaniel looked away toward the fire. That may be the rarest thing of all. Their conversation continued naturally after that. Easier than either expected. They discussed books, music, travel, the differences between London and Yorkshire. Clara spoke about learning to sew beside her grandmother. Nathaniel described estate management and tenant villages. Time slipped away unnoticed. For the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself talking without calculating every word. Without guarding every silence. Clara listened differently than anyone else. Most people listened while preparing their next response. She listened simply to understand. The realization felt strangely dangerous. At one point, Clara asked, "Do you enjoy being a duke?" Nathaniel nearly choked on his tea. That may be the most unexpected question I have ever received. That is not an answer. You are becoming alarmingly comfortable challenging me. Clara smiled. Should I stop? No. The answer arrived too quickly. Clara noticed. So did he. Neither commented. After a moment, Nathaniel sighed. Some days I enjoy it. And other days. He looked toward the window. Snow drifted beyond the glass. Other days it feels like a responsibility I inherited before I understood its cost. Clara nodded slowly. That sounds lonely too. Nathaniel laughed under his breath. You really do return to that conclusion. Because it keeps returning to you. The observation should have annoyed him. Instead it felt oddly comforting. As though someone had finally noticed what he spent years pretending did not exist. Eventually a clock chimed noon. Both seemed startled by the sound. Neither had realized how much time had passed. Nathaniel rose first. I should return to work. Clara smiled. People would become concerned if the estate collapsed because of a conversation. My steward already looks concerned. Clara laughed. Again that warm sound filled the room. Nathaniel found himself reluctant to leave. The realization unsettled him. Yet before he could examine it too closely, another thought appeared. Simpler. Unexpected. Hopeful. He wanted to see her again tomorrow. As he reached the doorway, Clara spoke. Your Grace? He turned. Yes? A gentle smile touched her face. You should laugh more often. Nathaniel stared at her for a second. Then something remarkable happened. A real smile appeared. Unforced. Unplanned. Genuine. It transformed his entire expression. Clara could not see it. Yet somehow she sensed it anyway. Perhaps, he said quietly, I will try. After he left, Clara remained beside the fire for several minutes. Listening to the fading sound of his footsteps. Somewhere deep inside Raven-shire Hall, something was beginning to change. Neither of them fully understood it yet. But for the first time in many years, two lonely people had started looking forward to the same tomorrow. The change began so gradually that few people noticed it at first. Raven-shire Hall continued operating as it always had. Servants performed their duties. Estate business filled Nathaniel's mornings. Clara worked in the sewing room surrounded by fabrics, sketches, and unanswered questions about gowns that still had no bride. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, something unusual was happening. The Duke of Raven-shire was spending time with someone. Not a guest of noble rank. Not a politician. Not a business associate. A seamstress from Yorkshire. The household noticed. Households always noticed. By the second week of Clara's stay, conversations frequently paused whenever she entered a room. Smiles appeared where whispers had existed before. Even Mrs. Fairchild had begun looking suspiciously pleased. Clara found it all deeply confusing. One afternoon she sat in the workroom examining a length of ivory silk when the Dowager Duchess arrived unannounced. "You look troubled." Clara laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret settled into a nearby chair. "To me?" "Yes." "Then perhaps I am losing my talent for concealment. What is bothering you?" Clara hesitated. "Everyone in this house behaves strangely." Margaret nearly smiled. "That is a broad accusation. They become cheerful whenever your son enters a room. That does sound suspicious." Clara shook her head. "No. More than cheerful." She lowered her voice. "Hopeful." Margaret's expression softened immediately. For a moment she looked very much like a mother rather than a duchess. "Perhaps they are." Clara considered that answer. Before she could ask another question, a servant appeared at the doorway. "Your Grace." "Yes?" "The first guests have arrived." Margaret exchanged a glance with the servant. Then she looked back toward Clara. "I fear your peaceful days are about to end." Clara frowned. "What guests?" The Dowager Duchess smiled with the expression of someone who knew trouble was approaching and had already accepted it. "The house party." Clara's stomach sank. What house party? 2 days later, Raven-shire Hall no longer felt quiet. Carriages arrived throughout the morning and afternoon. Voices echoed through corridors. Luggage appeared everywhere. The estate transformed into a center of aristocratic activity. Clara quickly learned that Margaret had invited nearly 20 guests for a series of dinners, musical evenings, and social gatherings extending over several weeks. According to Mrs. Fairchild, such events had once been common. According to everyone else, they had become increasingly rare. Especially since Nathaniel usually avoided them whenever possible. Clara spent most of the first day hidden inside the workroom. Unfortunately, hiding proved impossible. Shortly after luncheon, Emily entered looking nervous. "Miss Bennett." "Yes?" "The Dowager Duchess requests your presence in the blue drawing room." Clara immediately became suspicious. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "I believe she wishes to introduce you." Clara closed her eyes. "To whom?" "Everyone." 10 minutes later, Clara found herself standing inside one of the largest drawing rooms in the house. Conversations filled the air. Laughter drifted from every corner. Fine china clinked against saucers. Expensive perfume mingled with the scent of tea and flowers. Aristocratic society had arrived in full force. Margaret guided her gently into the room. "There is no need to be nervous." Clara smiled weakly. "Easy for you to say. I assure you, most of them are harmless." "Most?" Margaret laughed. "You are learning quickly." Introductions began immediately. Ladies. Gentlemen. Viscounts. Earls. Widows. Daughters. Cousins. Clara struggled to remember half the names. Most guests treated her politely. Some even warmly. Others clearly did not understand why a seamstress occupied such a prominent position within the household. Clara recognized those reactions instantly. Years of experience had taught her how to hear judgment hidden behind courtesy. Then another voice entered the conversation. Smooth. Elegant. Beautifully controlled. "So this is Miss Bennett." The room seemed to shift. Margaret's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Clara noticed. The newcomer approached. Every footstep radiated confidence. Lady Victoria Ashcroft, Margaret said. Clara immediately recognized the name. Even in Yorkshire, stories about Lady Victoria circulated regularly. Wealthy. Beautiful. Well-connected. The woman most of society expected to become a duchess someday. Victoria's smile sounded flawless. I have heard so much about you. Clara returned the smile. I hope none of it was alarming. A few guests laughed politely. Victoria did not. Only unusual. Something in her tone made Clara instantly cautious. Unusual can be interesting. Sometimes. Victoria paused. And sometimes it is merely unusual. Silence followed. Brief but noticeable. Margaret stepped smoothly into the conversation before tension could deepen. Miss Bennett has been assisting me with several projects. How admirable. Victoria's voice remained perfectly pleasant. Too pleasant. Clara recognized the type immediately. Some people sharpened knives. Others sharpened words. Victoria clearly preferred the second method. The gathering continued. Conversations shifted. Tea was served. Yet Clara increasingly sensed Lady Victoria's attention lingering nearby. Watching. Evaluating. Measuring. Later that evening, the guests assembled for dinner. Clara had not expected to attend. Unfortunately, Margaret insisted. Absolutely not. Clara stared in disbelief. Your Grace, I am a dressmaker. And my guest. This seems like a terrible idea. Then we shall face the terrible idea together. The result was exactly as uncomfortable as Clara feared. The dining room glittered beneath enormous chandeliers. More than 30 guests occupied the long table. Crystal reflected candlelight. Silver gleamed. Conversation flowed continuously. Clara found herself seated farther down the table than the aristocratic guests. A placement she considered entirely appropriate. Unfortunately, several people seemed determined to remind her of it. Midway through the meal, a gentleman she barely knew leaned toward his neighbor. His voice carried farther than intended. Or perhaps exactly as far as intended. Remarkable situation. Clara continued eating calmly. What is? Asked another guest. A seamstress dining among dukes and earls. Quiet laughter followed. Not cruel. Yet not kind either. Clara lowered her gaze to her plate. Years of experience helped her maintain composure. Embarrassment rarely disappeared. It simply became easier to hide. Further down the table, another woman spoke. The Dowager Duchess has always enjoyed unusual projects. More laughter. Clara heard every word. So did several others. The room grew subtly uncomfortable. Most guests recognized poor behavior when they heard it. Few challenged it directly. Nathaniel sat near the opposite end of the table engaged in conversation with an elderly earl. At least, he had been. The moment the comments began, his attention shifted. Clara did not notice. Everyone else did. A silence gradually spread outward. One conversation after another faded. Forks paused. Glasses lowered. Lady Victoria observed everything with careful interest. Then came the final remark. Soft. Amused. Meant to sound harmless. Perhaps next season we shall invite the stable master as well. This time the laughter was noticeably weaker. Because everyone had seen Nathaniel set down his wine glass. The sound was quiet. Yet somehow it carried through the room. Complete silence followed. Nathaniel looked toward the speaker. His expression remained calm. Controlled. Polite. Which made it infinitely worse. Mr. Holloway. The gentleman immediately straightened. Your Grace? Nathaniel's voice never rose. It never needed to. Miss Bennett is a guest of this house. Of course. Any guest welcomed here receives the same respect I expect for myself." The silence deepened. No one moved. No one spoke. Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on the man. "Have I made myself clear?" Mr. Holloway swallowed. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." Nathaniel inclined his head once. "Good." Then he returned to his meal as though nothing unusual had happened. Conversation resumed slowly. Carefully. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Clara sat motionless. Heat rushed into her cheeks. Not from humiliation this time. Something else. Something far more dangerous. Across the room, Lady Victoria watched the entire exchange. And for the first time since arriving at Raven-shire Hall, genuine concern touched her thoughts. Because she had expected many things from Nathaniel Blackthorne. Indifference. Certainly. Courtesy. Always. Protection of a seamstress against members of his own social circle? Never. Later that night, as guests drifted toward drawing rooms and music salons, whispers began spreading through the house party. Not about a future duchess. Not about a political alliance. Not about Lady Victoria Ashcroft. They spoke instead about the blind seamstress from Yorkshire. And the way the Duke had looked at her when the room turned against her. Unbeknownst to Clara, the first true storm of the season had just begun. The morning after the dinner felt different. Not because Raven-shire Hall had changed. The same servants moved through the same corridors. The same fires warmed the same rooms. The same guests filled the house with conversation and laughter. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension had taken hold. Clara sensed it almost immediately. People lowered their voices when she approached. Conversations shifted. Certain guests suddenly became far more interested in her presence than they had been before. She did not need sight to recognize scrutiny. It carried its own weight. By late morning she had retreated to the workroom, hoping to escape the attention. For a while, it worked. Fabric behaved more predictably than society. Silk never whispered behind one's back. Lace never judged. Needles never pretended kindness while sharpening insults. Clara was adjusting a delicate sleeve when footsteps entered the room. She smiled before the visitor spoke. "Good morning, Your Grace." Nathaniel paused. "You continue to make that sound effortless." "Recognizing you." "Yes." Clara set down her work. "You walk as though you expect the world to move aside." Nathaniel almost smiled. "That sounds arrogant." "It sounds accurate." A brief silence followed. Then Clara's expression softened. "Thank you." Nathaniel knew exactly what she meant. "You should not have needed defending." Clara lowered her gaze. "Perhaps not." He stepped closer. "Mr. Holloway will not repeat the mistake." "You frightened him." "Good." The answer arrived so quickly that Clara laughed. Nathaniel found himself smiling despite his intentions. Then his expression became more serious. "Did the comments upset you?" Clara considered the question honestly. "A little." She folded her hands together. Not because they were cruel. Because they were familiar. Something tightened inside Nathaniel's chest. People have spoken that way before. Many times. Her voice remained calm. Most of them never realize how much they reveal about themselves. Nathaniel looked at her for several moments. "You deserve better." Clara smiled sadly. Most people deserve better than what the world gives them. The simplicity of the statement unsettled him. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was true. He studied her face. No bitterness. No self-pity. Only acceptance. Somehow that felt far more painful. Before he could respond, another voice interrupted from the doorway. "Am I disturbing something?" Lady Victoria Ashcroft entered the room. Her tone remained perfectly pleasant. Her timing was perfect as well. Too perfect. Nathaniel's expression cooled immediately. Clara noticed the change. Victoria crossed the room gracefully. "Miss Bennett. Lady Victoria. I hope you are recovering from last evening's excitement." Clara smiled politely. "I was unaware there had been any excitement." Victoria laughed softly. "How modest." Nathaniel remained silent. Victoria turned toward him. "Your Grace, everyone is speaking about your defense of Miss Bennett. Then everyone should find a more productive topic." The response landed with surgical precision. Victoria's smile barely faltered. "Barely?" Clara sensed the shift. The atmosphere suddenly felt much colder. "I merely meant that people admire loyalty." Nathaniel's voice remained calm. "Do they?" Victoria held his gaze. "Most do." Several seconds passed. Then she smiled again and changed the subject. Yet the exchange lingered long after she left the room. Clara waited until the door closed. "She does not like me." Nathaniel nearly laughed. "What gave it away?" "The fact that she sounds as though she is speaking through her teeth." That finally earned a genuine laugh. A real one. Deep and unexpected. Clara smiled instantly. Nathaniel noticed. "You seem pleased with yourself." "I enjoy being correct." "A dangerous habit." "My grandmother says the same thing." The conversation might have continued indefinitely if a servant had not appeared moments later. "Your Grace." "Yes?" "The guests are gathering for the afternoon walk." Nathaniel glanced toward Clara. An idea formed. Unexpected. Impulsive. Unusual. "Miss Bennett." "Yes?" "Would you care to join us?" Clara hesitated. A house full of aristocrats wandering through snow-covered gardens sounds suspiciously unpleasant. Nathaniel smiled. "I will consider that a maybe." Half an hour later, she found herself walking beside him through the winter gardens. To her immense surprise, the experience proved enjoyable. Mostly because Nathaniel remained at her side. The paths wound through dormant rose gardens and snow-covered hedges. Guests spread out across the grounds in small groups. Conversation drifted through the cold air. Clara listened carefully to the sounds around her. Birds hidden among bare branches. Wind brushing distant trees. Boots crunching softly against packed snow. "The lake is ahead," Nathaniel said. "How large?" "Nearly 30 acres. Clara whistled softly. "That seems excessive." "You continue to have strong opinions regarding scale. People rarely need things that large." Nathaniel looked toward the frozen lake. "You may be right." They continued walking. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Then Clara said quietly, "May I ask something personal?" Nathaniel should have refused. Instead he found himself saying, "Possibly." "The scar." He stopped walking. The wind seemed louder suddenly. Around them, distant voices continued. Yet for a moment the world narrowed. Clara immediately regretted the question. "You do not have to answer." Nathaniel stared across the frozen water. His expression became unreadable. Most people ask because they are curious. Clara waited. "Why are you asking?" She considered the answer carefully. "Because it hurts." Nathaniel looked at her. "The scar?" "No." Her voice softened. "Whatever happened afterward?" Silence settled between them. Long enough that Clara assumed he would not respond. Then he surprised her. "I had a younger sister." The words emerged quietly. As though unused. Clara listened. Nathaniel rarely spoke about the past. Almost never. Yet something about her made silence feel unnecessary. Her name was Eleanor. A faint smile touched his face. Brief and fragile. She was fearless. Clara smiled too. "That sounds dangerous." It often was. For a moment he seemed far away, somewhere beyond snow and winter and years of careful restraint. She laughed at everything. Clara heard the affection immediately. The loss too. You loved her very much. Nathaniel nodded once. Yes. The simple word carried enormous weight. Clara did not ask what happened. She did not need details. Grief spoke its own language. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. After she died, people expected time to fix things. He looked toward the distant horizon. It did not. Clara felt her heart ache. Not because of the story. Because of the loneliness hidden inside it. No, she said gently. It rarely does. Nathaniel turned toward her. Most people offered solutions. Advice. Comfort. Clara offered understanding. Somehow that meant more. They stood quietly beside the frozen lake. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere behind them, guests continued strolling through the gardens. Life carried on as it always did. Yet something important had happened. Nathaniel had shared a piece of himself that he guarded from almost everyone. Clara sensed the significance immediately. She did not press further. She simply remained beside him. Sometimes presence mattered more than words. Eventually they resumed walking. Neither spoke for several minutes. Yet the silence felt different now. Closer. Trust rarely arrived all at once. It appeared in small moments. A conversation. A confession. A decision to remain when leaving would be easier. By the time they returned to the house, several guests had noticed the pair walking together, including Lady Victoria. She stood near a drawing-room window watching their approach. Her expression remained perfectly composed. Only her eyes betrayed concern. Because she had known Nathaniel Blackthorne for years. Long enough to recognize something others might miss. He looked lighter. Not happy. Not yet. But lighter. As though a burden had shifted, if only slightly. And somehow, impossibly, the blind seamstress from Yorkshire seemed connected to the change. That realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Later that evening, after dinner and music and endless conversation, Clara sat alone beside the fire in her suite. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the frozen lake. To Eleanor. To the sorrow hidden beneath Nathaniel's careful composure. The scar remained a mystery. But now she understood something more important. It was not the wound itself that shaped him. It was the loss attached to it. Somewhere within Raven-shire Hall, Nathaniel sat alone in his study staring into another fire. For the first time in years, the memory of his sister had not left him feeling completely isolated. Someone else knew her name now. Someone else had listened without judgment or pity. The realization should not have mattered. Yet it did. More than he wanted to admit. And neither of them noticed the growing whispers moving through the house around them. Whispers that would soon become impossible to ignore. The whispers reached London before Clara ever left Raven-shire Hall. That was the nature of aristocratic society. A glance became a rumor. A rumor became a story. A story became accepted truth before anyone bothered to verify it. By the end of the week, several guests had already written letters. Cousins informed cousins. Friends informed friends. Hostesses informed entire social circles. The details changed with every retelling. Some claimed the Duke had secretly become engaged. Others insisted he was preparing to marry beneath his station. A particularly imaginative version suggested that a mysterious woman at Raven-shire Hall had broken a decade of emotional isolation with a single conversation. Ironically, that version came closest to the truth. Clara knew none of this. She remained occupied with work. The gowns continued to multiply. New fabrics arrived almost daily. New instructions followed. Yet the identity of the bride remained a complete mystery. On a cold afternoon 3 days after the walk by the lake, Clara sat surrounded by sketches and ribbons when Emily burst into the workroom. "Miss Bennett." Clara immediately recognized alarm in her voice. "What happened?" Emily closed the door behind her. "There is a newspaper." Clara blinked. "I sincerely hope that is not the emergency. It is when your name appears in it." The room fell silent. Clara slowly set down her needle. "My name? Well, not exactly." Emily handed the paper to Mrs. Fairchild, who had entered moments earlier carrying a basket of folded fabric. The housekeeper scanned the article. Her expression darkened immediately. "Oh dear." Clara's stomach tightened. "What does it say?" Mrs. Fairchild hesitated. "Never a good sign." "Mrs. Fairchild." The older woman sighed. "A London society column claims a mysterious lady residing at Raven-shire Hall has captured the attention of the Duke." Clara laughed once. The sound contained no humor. "That is ridiculous." "Unfortunately," Mrs. Fairchild replied, "ridiculous stories are often the most popular." Clara reached for the edge of the table. "Do they name anyone?" Another pause. "Not directly." Emily shifted nervously. "But everyone knows who they mean." Clara sat very still. A strange feeling settled inside her chest. Not fear exactly. More like dread. The kind that arrives when one realizes a private life is becoming public property. Mrs. Fairchild folded the newspaper carefully. "It will pass." Yet her voice lacked conviction. Clara noticed. By dinner, the article had spread through the house party. Some guests found it amusing. Others found it fascinating. A few clearly believed every word. Clara became the center of attention whether she wished it or not. The situation worsened during an evening musicale. Guests gathered inside the grand drawing room. Candles glowed. Music drifted through the air. Conversations filled every corner. Clara had hoped to remain unnoticed. The hope lasted approximately 6 minutes. "Miss Bennett." A woman's voice approached. Clara recognized Lady Penrose from previous introductions. "Good evening. You have become quite famous." Clara forced a smile. "That sounds alarming." Several ladies laughed. "Not kindly. Surely you have read the article." "I have not." "How refreshing." Another voice joined the conversation. "Most women would frame it." Clara remained silent. She recognized the trap. Any response would only encourage further discussion. Unfortunately, silence encouraged it as well. "The Duke appears very attentive." Remarkably attentive. Extraordinary for a man who usually avoids everyone. Clara felt dozens of eyes settling upon her. The room suddenly seemed warmer. Smaller. Harder to breathe in. "You misunderstand," she said quietly. "His Grace has simply been kind." The women exchanged glances. One laughed. Men rarely become the subject of gossip because they are merely kind. More laughter followed. Clara's hands tightened around her fan. Across the room, Lady Victoria observed everything. She did not participate. She did not need to. The damage was already unfolding exactly as she expected. Social pressure often accomplished what direct cruelty could not. A woman did not need to be attacked openly. She only needed to be made uncomfortable enough to leave on her own. Clara turned slightly. "If you will excuse me." "Of course." "Naturally. We did not mean to embarrass you." The words sounded sympathetic. The satisfaction beneath them did not. Clara walked away carefully. Maintaining composure required effort. More effort than she wished to admit. She crossed the room. Then another. Then a corridor. Finally she reached the relative safety of the library. The moment the door closed behind her, she released a slow breath. Silence greeted her. Blessed silence. She moved toward the fireplace and sat down. For several minutes she simply listened to the crackling flames. Gradually the tightness in her chest eased. Then the library door opened again. Clara immediately recognized the footsteps. Nathaniel stopped. "Miss Bennett." She smiled faintly. "You always seem to find me in libraries. You always seem to hide in them." Clara laughed softly. The sound lacked its usual warmth. Nathaniel noticed immediately. What happened? She considered lying. The idea lasted approximately 2 seconds. I became a topic of conversation. Nathaniel's expression hardened. The article. Clara looked surprised. You know about it. Unfortunately. He crossed the room and stood near the fireplace. I should have anticipated this. Clara shook her head. You are not responsible for gossip. Perhaps not. His jaw tightened slightly. But I know how society operates. Clara stared into the fire. I do not belong here. The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence followed. Nathaniel felt something twist painfully inside his chest. That is not true. Is it not? Clara's voice remained calm. Yet sadness lingered beneath it. One article appears and suddenly everyone remembers I am a seamstress. Nathaniel moved closer. There is nothing wrong with being a seamstress. Clara smiled sadly. You know that. So should everyone else. Yet they do not. The truth settled heavily between them. Nathaniel could not argue because she was right. Too many people measured worth through titles. Through wealth. Through birth. Clara possessed none of those advantages. Yet she carried more dignity than most of the aristocrats currently filling his house. The unfairness infuriated him. Miss Bennett. She turned toward his voice. Yes? Look at me. Clara laughed gently. That request seems particularly cruel. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. You know what I mean. The smile faded from her face. Yes. Several seconds passed. Then Nathaniel spoke quietly. You belong wherever you choose to stand. Clara swallowed. No one had ever said those words to her. Not quite that way. Not with such certainty. Your Grace. Nathaniel. The correction arrived automatically. Clara fell silent. It was the first time he had insisted. The first time he had openly removed the barrier of his title between them. The realization left both momentarily speechless. Finally Clara spoke. Very softly. Nathaniel. Hearing his name in her voice affected him far more than it should have. Good. Clara smiled despite herself. You are surprisingly stubborn. So I have been told. The atmosphere lightened slightly. Yet only slightly. The hurt remained. Nathaniel could still hear it beneath her calm exterior. What exactly did they say? Clara groaned. Absolutely not. Why not? Because then you will become angry. That is possible. Clara laughed. A genuine laugh this time. See? Nathaniel almost smiled. You have very little faith in my self-control. Experience suggests caution. Before he could answer, another sound interrupted them. Footsteps. 2 sets. The library door opened. Lady Victoria entered accompanied by Mr. Holloway. Both stopped abruptly upon discovering they were not alone. An awkward silence followed. Clara sensed it instantly. Victoria recovered first. Your Grace. Nathaniel's expression cooled. Lady Victoria. Mr. Holloway offered a nervous bow. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable. Finally Victoria smiled. We did not realize the library was occupied. Clearly. Nathaniel's tone left little room for interpretation. Another silence followed. Then Victoria glanced toward Clara. "Miss Bennett, I hope you are not taking society's curiosity too seriously." Clara remained polite. "I try not to." Victoria smiled. "Good. Because these things pass quickly." The word sounded harmless. Yet Clara heard the hidden meaning. Temporary. Passing. Insignificant. Nathaniel heard it too. His expression hardened. Indeed. His voice remained calm. Dangerously calm. Which is why sensible people avoid contributing to it. Victoria's smile vanished for a fraction of a second. Long enough. Then she recovered. Of course. The conversation ended there. It had to. Moments later Victoria and Mr. Holloway withdrew. Yet the encounter left behind an unpleasant certainty. The whispers were no longer confined to servants or guests. They had become part of the social landscape itself. As the door closed once more, Clara lowered her gaze. This is becoming worse. Nathaniel looked toward the fire. Then toward her. A decision formed somewhere deep inside him. Not fully realized yet. But growing stronger every day. Perhaps, he said quietly, it is time people learned that some things are worth defending. Clara did not fully understand what he meant. Yet something in his voice made her heart beat a little faster. Outside the library, snow continued falling across Raven-shire Hall. Inside, the distance between two people grew steadily smaller while the world around them became determined to push them apart. Neither realized how quickly those two forces were moving toward collision. The next 3 days unfolded beneath a growing shadow. Outwardly, life at Raven-shire Hall continued as before. Guests attended dinners. Musicians performed in drawing rooms. Carriages arrived and departed. Conversations flowed through candlelit halls. Yet beneath the polished surface, tension gathered quietly. Clara felt it everywhere. She felt it in the sudden silences when she entered a room. In the carefully disguised questions. In the sympathetic tones that somehow felt worse than open criticism. Every morning brought fresh rumors from London. Every evening carried new whispers from guests who pretended not to gossip while discussing nothing else. Clara endured it with grace. At least outwardly. In private, the strain began to show. Nathaniel noticed immediately. He noticed because he had begun noticing everything about her. The way she laughed less often. The way her shoulders stiffened when unfamiliar voices approached. The way she lingered longer in quiet rooms and shorter in crowded ones. It angered him more than he cared to admit. One afternoon he found her alone in the conservatory. Winter sunlight filtered through glass walls. Bare vines climbed iron frames overhead. The room smelled faintly of earth and dormant flowers waiting for spring. Clara sat beside a small table, her hands folded in her lap. She was not sewing. That alone concerned him. "You are hiding again." A faint smile touched her lips. "I prefer the word escaping." Nathaniel sat across from her. "That implies pursuit. Does it not exist?" He could not answer immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Clara sighed softly. "Exactly." Nathaniel studied her face. "You should not have to leave rooms because other people lack manners. And yet here we are. You make it sound inevitable." Clara turned her head toward the glass ceiling above them. "Some battles cannot be won." "I disagree." "You would." The observation carried gentle affection rather than criticism. Nathaniel felt something warm settle unexpectedly in his chest. Clara continued. "You have spent your entire life being heard when you speak." He frowned. "That is not always an advantage." "No. But it is a privilege." Nathaniel leaned back slightly. The word lingered between them. Privilege. He disliked how accurate it sounded. Clara smiled sadly. When people attack me, they lose nothing. That is not true. It is. Her fingers tightened together. When they attack you, society notices. When they attack someone like me, society calls it entertainment. Nathaniel looked away. Because once again she was right. That evening another article appeared in London. Worse than the first. Far worse. The anonymous writer suggested that the Duke's judgment had become compromised. That a woman of no social standing had somehow gained influence within Raven-shire Hall. The article never mentioned Clara by name. It did not need to. Everyone understood. By breakfast the following morning, copies had already reached the estate. Nathaniel read the article in silence. Then folded the newspaper once. Carefully. Deliberately. His steward wisely said nothing. Across the house, Margaret Blackthorne received the same article. Unlike her son, she immediately understood the danger. Not political. Emotional. She found Clara later that afternoon in the sewing room. My dear. Clara instantly recognized concern in her voice. What happened? Margaret hesitated. I think I owe you an apology. Clara looked surprised. For what? For bringing you here. The room fell silent. Clara slowly set aside a piece of lace. You do not owe me that. I do. Margaret sat beside her. I invited you into a situation that has become increasingly unfair. Clara smiled gently. That was not your intention. Intentions do not erase consequences. Clara reached for the older woman's hand. You have been kinder to me than most people in my life. Margaret's eyes softened immediately. You truly are remarkable. Clara laughed softly. My grandmother says I am stubborn. Both can be true. Yet after Margaret left, the conversation remained with her. The house suddenly felt different. Larger. More distant. For the first time since arriving at Raven-shire Hall, Clara allowed herself to consider a possibility she had carefully avoided. Leaving. The thought hurt more than expected. Which alone should have frightened her. That evening she sat beside the fire in her suite long after midnight. Everyone else slept. The estate had finally grown quiet. Clara listened to the distant creaks and settling sounds of an old house. Somewhere a clock marked the passing hours. She thought about Yorkshire. About her grandmother. About simple days spent sewing without becoming a topic of national discussion. Then she thought about Nathaniel. That thought proved more difficult. Because leaving Raven-shire Hall would not simply mean leaving a commission. It would mean leaving him. The realization made her chest ache. Clara closed her eyes. That answered everything. The next morning she made her decision. Emily found her packing shortly after sunrise. Miss Bennett. Clara smiled. Good morning. The maid stared at an open trunk. What are you doing? Going home. The word sounded calmer than she felt. Emily's face lost all color. Home. Clara nodded. Yorkshire has managed without me for several weeks. I suspect it misses me terribly. Does His Grace know? Clara hesitated. No. The Dowager Duchess. Not yet. Emily looked horrified. You cannot simply leave. Clara laughed softly. That is generally how leaving works. Yet beneath the humor, sadness lingered. Deep and unavoidable. By noon, Margaret knew. By 1 o'clock, Mrs. Fairchild knew. By 2 o'clock, half the household knew. The news spread with astonishing speed. Only one person remained unaware. Nathaniel spent the afternoon inspecting tenant farms several miles from the estate. When he finally returned near sunset, he immediately sensed something wrong. Servants avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. The atmosphere felt strange. He found his mother in the blue drawing room. One glance at her expression erased any remaining doubt. What happened? Margaret looked up from her book. Clara is leaving. The word struck harder than he expected. Much harder. For a moment he simply stared. Leaving. Tomorrow morning. Silence filled the room. Then another question emerged. Quiet. Dangerous. Why? Margaret closed the book slowly. Nathaniel. Why? She met his gaze. Because society has made her life miserable. The truth landed with brutal precision. Nathaniel turned toward the window. Snow drifted across the estate beyond the glass. White. Silent. Endless. His jaw tightened. Did anyone stop her? Margaret sighed. She believes leaving will solve the problem. Nathaniel's voice lowered. Will it? For her? Margaret hesitated. Perhaps. The answer should have comforted him. Instead it made everything worse. Because suddenly he understood something he had been avoiding for weeks. Clara's departure mattered. Not because she was a guest. Not because she was kind. Not because she listened. It mattered because somewhere along the way, she had become necessary. The realization arrived all at once. Clear and undeniable. Nathaniel left the room without another word. Margaret watched him go. For the first time in years, hope flickered cautiously inside her heart. Upstairs, Clara finished folding the last of her belongings into a trunk. Her decision remained unchanged. It had to. Staying would only worsen the scandal. Staying would only damage Nathaniel further. The thought hurt. Yet she accepted it. Some forms of caring required sacrifice. Outside her window, snow continued falling across Raven-shire Hall. Neither Clara nor Nathaniel slept much that night. One prepared to leave. The other had just realized he could not bear to let her go. Dawn arrived beneath a sky heavy with snow. Raven-shire Hall stood silent beneath a blanket of white as though the entire estate had paused to witness a farewell. Clara had been awake for hours. Sleep had proven impossible. Her trunk stood packed beside the door. The last of her belongings had already been prepared for transport. Everything was ready. Everything except her heart. She sat beside the dying embers of the fireplace and listened to the familiar sounds of the house. A servant crossing a distant corridor. A clock marking another quarter hour. Wind brushing softly against the windows. Soon those sounds would belong to memory. A knock came shortly after sunrise. Clara already knew who it was. Come in. Margaret entered. Neither woman spoke immediately. The Dowager Duchess crossed the room and embraced her. Clara returned the embrace tightly. I hate this, Margaret admitted quietly. Clara smiled through the ache in her chest. I know. You should not be leaving this way. Perhaps not. Margaret stepped back. Then stay. Clara lowered her gaze. I cannot. The older woman sighed. Because of the gossip? Because of what the gossip will become. Clara folded her hands together. Every day I remain here makes things harder for him. Margaret stared at her. You honestly believe that? Clara nodded. I do. For several moments, silence settled between them. Then Margaret spoke softly. My son has spent 8 years hiding from life. Clara's breath caught. Your Grace. No. Listen to me. Emotion trembled beneath the older woman's composure. You are the first person who has made him laugh in years. Clara closed her eyes briefly. The words hurt more than they should have. That does not change reality. Sometimes reality changes because of people. Clara smiled sadly. Sometimes people leave before they get the chance. Neither woman had an answer to that. Downstairs, Nathaniel stood alone in his study staring at the same letter for nearly 10 minutes without reading a single word. The fire burned low beside him. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Somewhere above, Clara was preparing to leave. Every instinct urged him to stop her. Yet uncertainty held him motionless. Not uncertainty about his feelings. Those had become impossible to deny. The uncertainty came from somewhere older. Deeper. More dangerous. Fear. The realization disgusted him. Nathaniel Blackthorne was not afraid of business negotiations. Not afraid of public criticism. Not afraid of responsibility. Yet one woman preparing to board a carriage had reduced him to complete paralysis. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Mrs. Fairchild stepped inside. The housekeeper rarely entered his study without invitation. The fact that she had done so now told him everything. She is leaving within the hour. Nathaniel remained silent. Mrs. Fairchild folded her hands. Forgive me, Your Grace. For what? Speaking where it is not my place. Nathaniel looked up. Go on. The housekeeper took a steady breath. I have served this family for 22 years. I am aware. And during those 22 years, I have never seen you happy. The statement landed with startling force. Nathaniel stared at her. Mrs. Fairchild continued before courage abandoned her. Not truly happy. Silence filled the room. The fire crackled softly. Finally the housekeeper lowered her voice. Until now. Then she left. Nathaniel remained motionless long after the door closed. Across the house, Clara descended the grand staircase for the final time. Servants gathered discreetly throughout the entrance hall. Emily was crying openly. Mrs. Fairchild looked as though she wanted to. Even the footman appeared unusually solemn. Clara laughed softly despite herself. Good heavens! One would think I had died. Emily wiped her eyes. It feels a little like it. Clara embraced the young maid. I am only returning to Yorkshire. That is far enough. The carriage waited outside. Horses stamped impatiently against the cold. Snowflakes drifted through the air. Clara exchanged final farewells. Final thanks. Final smiles. Yet one absence grew increasingly impossible to ignore. Nathaniel had not appeared. She told herself that was for the best. It changed nothing. The disappointment still hurt. Arthur Graves loaded the last trunk. We should leave soon if we hope to reach the next town before dark. Clara nodded. Of course. She stepped toward the door. Then stopped. Not because she heard anything. Because the entrance hall had suddenly fallen silent. Complete silence. Every servant. Every maid. Every footman. No one moved. No one spoke. Clara slowly turned toward the staircase. Footsteps echoed above. Strong. Familiar. Deliberate. Nathaniel descended one step at a time. He wore no coat despite the cold. No gloves. No expression. Yet something about him felt different. Determined. Clara's pulse quickened immediately. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Nathaniel reached the bottom step and stopped several feet away. Neither spoke at first. Then Clara smiled gently. I was beginning to think you intended to avoid saying goodbye. Nathaniel looked at her. Truly looked at her. I considered it. The honesty surprised a few servants. It did not surprise Clara. And? A long silence followed. Then Nathaniel answered. It was a terrible idea. Clara laughed softly. The sound wavered slightly. Nathaniel noticed. So did she. I should go. The words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. No. The single word echoed through the hall. Clara blinked. Several servants exchanged startled glances. Nathaniel. No. He stepped closer. You are leaving because of me. Because of society. Because of me. Clara hesitated. I do not want your life damaged by rumors. Something flickered across his face. Pain. Frustration. Determination. My life was damaged long before you arrived. Silence followed. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Nathaniel took another step forward. You asked me once about the scar. Clara's breath caught. He had never spoken of it again. Until now. Yes. His gaze drifted briefly toward the windows where snow continued falling. The scar came from a fire. The room remained utterly still. 8 years ago. His voice lowered. Eleanor became trapped inside a guest cottage during a storm. Clara felt her heart ache immediately. Nathaniel continued. Not because he wanted to. Because he finally needed to. I reached her. The words nearly failed. But not in time. Emotion tightened his throat. For a moment he looked away. Then forced himself onward. Everyone called it an accident. Silence swallowed the room. Everyone said there was nothing I could have done. Clara stood perfectly still. Listening. Understanding. But you blamed yourself. Nathaniel laughed once. The sound held no humor. Every day. Years of grief hid inside those 2 words. Years of regret. Years of loneliness. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. Nathaniel met her gaze. The scar healed. His voice softened. The guilt never did. Nobody in the hall moved. Even the servants seemed frozen. Because they understood what they were witnessing. A man who never revealed weakness. Revealing everything. Clara swallowed hard. Nathaniel. The way she spoke his name nearly broke him. Then you arrived. He took another step closer. And for the first time in 8 years, someone touched that scar without fear. Clara's breath trembled. I did not know. Exactly. His voice grew rough. Honest. Vulnerable. You did not see the scar. He looked directly at her. You saw me. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. She made no attempt to hide them. Neither did he. For a moment the entire world seemed to disappear. No guests. No servants. No titles. No gossip. Only 2 people standing in the middle of an enormous hall. Nathaniel drew a slow breath. Then spoke the truth he had spent weeks trying to avoid. I cannot let you leave. Complete silence followed. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if everyone could hear it. Nathaniel took one final step forward. Close enough now that neither needed to raise their voices. Not because society is wrong. His eyes never left hers. Because for the first time in years, I know exactly what I want. The words hung between them. Dangerous. Irreversible. Yet before Clara could answer, a servant hurried through the entrance doors carrying a freshly arrived newspaper. He stopped abruptly upon sensing the atmosphere. Too late. The newspaper slipped from his hand. It struck the floor and unfolded. A headline stared upward from the front page. Another article. Another scandal. Another public attack. This time far larger than before. And suddenly everyone in the hall understood the truth. The battle that had begun in whispers was about to explode into the open. The newspaper remained on the marble floor like a warning no one wanted to read. Silence gripped the entrance hall. Snow drifted beyond the open doors. Clara stood motionless, her heart still racing from Nathaniel's confession. Around them, servants waited in stunned disbelief. No one seemed quite certain what to do next. Nathaniel was the first to move. He bent down, retrieved the newspaper, and scanned the front page. The longer he read, the colder his expression became. Margaret descended the staircase moments later and immediately recognized danger. Nathaniel. He handed her the paper without a word. The Dowager Duchess read quickly, then closed her eyes. Good heavens! Clara swallowed. What does it say? Margaret hesitated. Nathaniel answered instead. Someone claims I am preparing to disgrace my family by elevating a woman beneath my station. The words echoed through the hall. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Nathaniel continued. The article suggests my judgment has become compromised. His voice remained calm. Too calm. It also names you directly. The room seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. For weeks she had endured rumors without names. Suggestions. Hints. Speculation. This was different. This was public. Direct. Impossible to ignore. Nathaniel folded the newspaper once, then handed it to a nearby servant. Burn it. The servant blinked. Your Grace? Immediately. Yes, Your Grace. The man hurried away. Clara stood quietly. You should let me leave. Nathaniel turned toward her. No. Nathaniel. No. The certainty in his voice silenced everyone. Clara felt tears threatening again. The article proves exactly what I feared. It proves society enjoys cruelty. It proves I am hurting you. Nathaniel took a step closer. You are not hurting me. Then why is this happening? The question escaped before she could stop it. Nathaniel looked at her for several seconds. Then he answered honestly. Because people fear what they do not understand. Clara lowered her gaze. And what exactly do they not understand? The answer arrived immediately. Why I would choose you. The hall fell silent again. Even now, hearing those words left Clara breathless. Nathaniel looked toward his mother. Cancel her carriage. Margaret smiled slowly. With pleasure. Clara stared in disbelief. You are both impossible. For the first time in weeks, Margaret laughed openly. That runs in the family. By afternoon, the decision had been made. Clara would remain at Raven-shire Hall. At least temporarily. Yet Nathaniel understood something important. The battle had moved beyond private conversations and newspaper columns. Society would not stop. Not until it received an answer. The realization followed him throughout the day. Through estate meetings. Through correspondence. Through every conversation. By evening he had reached a conclusion. The next morning he informed his mother. Margaret listened carefully. Then smiled. It is about time. 3 days later, London buzzed with anticipation. Invitations had been issued for a grand charity ball at Ashcombe House. Nearly every important family in society planned to attend. The event had already been expected to dominate conversation. Recent scandals elevated interest even further. Rumors spread rapidly. Would Nathaniel attend? Would Lady Victoria finally secure his attention? Would the mysterious seamstress appear? Nobody knew. That uncertainty only increased public fascination. On the evening of the ball, carriages lined the street for blocks. Chandeliers illuminated enormous windows. Music drifted into the night. Diamonds sparkled beneath candlelight. The finest members of English society gathered beneath one roof. Lady Victoria arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. She looked magnificent. Her gown shimmered like liquid silver. Conversations followed her wherever she moved. Yet despite the admiration surrounding her, she remained distracted. Waiting. Watching. Listening. An hour passed. Then another. The Duke had not arrived. Speculation intensified. Some believed he intended to avoid the event entirely. Others argued he was making a statement. Then the butler's voice echoed across the ballroom. His Grace, the Duke of Raven-shire. Every conversation stopped. Heads turned simultaneously toward the entrance. Nathaniel entered exactly as he always did. Calm. Composed. Impeccably dressed. Yet something felt different. People sensed it immediately. He no longer looked detached. He no longer looked as though he wished to escape. Instead, he appeared absolutely certain of himself. Victoria smiled and began moving toward him. Then she stopped. Because someone else had entered beside him. Complete silence swept through the ballroom. Clara stood at Nathaniel's side. A collective breath seemed to pass through the crowd. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue. Elegant but understated. Beautiful without demanding attention. Yet attention found her anyway. Not because of the dress. Because of the man standing beside her. Clara's hand rested lightly on Nathaniel's arm. She could feel every eye in the room. Every whisper. Every judgment. Fear fluttered briefly inside her chest. Then Nathaniel spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Do you trust me? Clara nodded once. Yes. Good. Together they entered the ballroom. The silence followed them. Conversations attempted to restart and failed. Dozens of people watched openly. Some with curiosity. Some with shock. Some with disapproval. Lady Victoria remained perfectly still. Her expression never changed. Only her eyes betrayed the truth. She understood exactly what was happening. Nathaniel guided Clara through the room without hesitation. No apology. No embarrassment. No attempt to create distance. The message was unmistakable. Several guests approached. Greetings were exchanged. Polite conversations followed. Yet beneath every interaction lingered the same question. Why her? Eventually someone voiced it. Not directly. Society rarely operated that way. Lord Penrose smiled politely. Miss Bennett appears remarkably comfortable among the aristocracy. Clara returned the smile. Everyone has been very kind. The statement was so gracious that several nearby listeners looked uncomfortable. Nathaniel almost smiled. Then another guest spoke. One must admit the situation is unusual. The ballroom quieted once more. Clara recognized the trap immediately. Before she could respond, Nathaniel did. Why? The gentleman blinked. I beg your pardon. Nathaniel's expression remained calm. Why is it unusual? Silence followed. The man struggled for an answer that would not expose his own prejudice. Well. Nathaniel waited. The ballroom waited with him. Finally the gentleman lowered his gaze. Because there was no acceptable answer. Nathaniel inclined his head once. Conversation ended. The victory was small. Yet everyone noticed. Clara certainly did. Hours later, the orchestra began a new waltz. Couples moved toward the dance floor. Lady Victoria approached Nathaniel one final time. Her smile remained flawless. May I have this dance? The question carried years of expectation behind it. The entire ballroom seemed to pause. Waiting. Nathaniel looked at her kindly. Respectfully. Then shook his head. No. Shock flashed briefly across Victoria's face. Not because of the refusal. She had experienced that before. Because of what happened next. Nathaniel turned toward Clara. Would you care to walk with me? Clara's breath caught. The ballroom went completely silent. Every person present understood the significance immediately. Nathaniel was making a choice. Not privately. Publicly. Irrevocably. Clara slowly placed her hand on his arm. Together they crossed the ballroom beneath hundreds of watching eyes. No one spoke. No one dared. Because for the first time in nearly a decade, the Duke of Raven-shire was no longer hiding from society. He was standing directly in front of it. And he was making it unmistakably clear which side he had chosen. The ballroom remained silent long after Nathaniel and Clara crossed the floor together. Music continued. Candles flickered. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Yet all attention remained fixed upon them. Nathaniel felt it. Clara certainly felt it. But for the first time, neither allowed it to matter. They moved toward a quieter gallery overlooking the ballroom below. The orchestra's waltz drifted upward like a distant memory. For several moments they stood side by side without speaking. Clara rested one hand lightly against the stone railing. Her heart still raced. I believe half of London stopped breathing. Nathaniel looked down toward the crowd. Only half. Clara laughed softly. The familiar sound eased something inside him. You realize what happened tonight? I do. People will talk. They already do. The answer came so calmly that she smiled despite herself. Then her smile faded. Nathaniel. Yes? She hesitated. Why? He turned toward her. Why what? Why me? The question had waited between them for weeks. Perhaps from the beginning. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered with complete honesty. Because you never cared that I was a duke. Clara lowered her gaze. That cannot be the only reason. No. His voice softened. You listened when everyone else assumed. He stepped closer. You saw loneliness when everyone else saw privilege. Another step. You understood grief without demanding explanations. Clara felt tears threatening again. Nathaniel. And because when I was with you, I stopped pretending to be someone stronger than I felt. Silence settled gently around them. Below, music continued. Laughter drifted upward from distant corners of the ballroom. Yet the world seemed very far away. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket. Clara heard the movement immediately. Her pulse quickened. Nathaniel's own heart pounded harder than it had during any business negotiation, political dispute, or public appearance of his life. The realization would have amused him under different circumstances. He drew a small velvet box into the light. Clara froze. So did several guests who happened to glance toward the gallery. Word spread through the ballroom with astonishing speed. Conversations died. One by one, people noticed. Then everyone noticed. Nathaniel opened the box. A diamond ring caught the candlelight. Clara's breath caught sharply. I spent 8 years refusing every future people tried to choose for me. His voice remained steady. Barely. Then you arrived. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. She made no effort to hide them. Neither did he. Nathaniel took her hand. England offered me countless brides. A faint smile touched his face. And I refused every one. Several guests below leaned forward unconsciously. No one wanted to miss a single word. Nathaniel continued. Because none of them were you. Complete silence filled the ballroom. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Clara's heart felt too large for her chest. Too fragile. Too full. Nathaniel drew a slow breath. Then asked the only question that mattered. Clara Bennett. His voice lowered. Warm. Certain. Will you marry me? The world disappeared. The ballroom. The guests. The whispers. The years of loneliness. Everything vanished. Clara heard only his voice. Felt only his hand. Tears blurred her thoughts. She laughed through them. A trembling, joyful laugh. You already know the answer. Nathaniel smiled. A real smile. The kind that had once seemed impossible. I would still like to hear it. Clara squeezed his hand. Yes. Her voice broke slightly. Yes, I will. The reaction below was immediate. Gasps. Applause. Astonished murmurs. Several ladies openly cried. Even gentlemen appeared suspiciously emotional. Nathaniel slipped the ring onto her finger. Then simply looked at her. As though he still could not quite believe she was real. As though he feared blinking might somehow make her disappear. Clara smiled through her tears. You are staring. I know. It is becoming alarming. I do not care. She laughed again. The sound echoed softly through the gallery. Down below, Margaret Blackthorne sat with tears shining in her eyes. Mrs. Fairchild, who had somehow secured an invitation to the ball through the Dowager Duchess's influence, openly cried into a handkerchief. Emily would likely do the same once she heard the news. Lady Victoria remained near the ballroom entrance. For a long moment she watched the couple above. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not bitterly. Not sadly. Simply honestly. Some stories ended differently than expected. That did not make them wrong. She quietly turned and left before anyone noticed. There was dignity in that choice. The days that followed transformed England's favourite scandal into England's favourite romance. Newspapers reversed course with remarkable speed. The same writers who had mocked Clara now praised her grace and character. Society, eager to stand near happiness, quickly discovered reasons to approve of what it had recently condemned. Nathaniel ignored all of it. Clara found the reversal mildly amusing. Margaret found it entirely predictable. Spring arrived gradually across the countryside. Snow melted. Gardens awakened. Roses returned to Raven-shire Hall. Wedding preparations consumed the estate. This time there truly was a bride. The mystery of the gowns was finally solved. Clara laughed when she discovered several of the original designs had been intended for her all along. Your mother is frightening. Nathaniel smiled. You are only realizing this now? The wedding took place in late May beneath clear skies and blooming gardens. Guests traveled from across England. Not because they wished to witness a social triumph. Because they genuinely wished to celebrate. The chapel overflowed. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Flowers scented the air. When Clara walked toward the altar, guided by her grandmother, the entire congregation rose. Eleanor Bennett cried openly. Margaret cried openly. Several guests joined them. Nathaniel stood waiting at the front of the chapel. The moment he heard Clara approach, his expression softened completely. Gone was the distant Duke who had spent years hiding behind grief. In his place stood a man finally ready to live again. The ceremony itself felt almost secondary. Every vow carried meaning. Every promise felt earned. When they emerged from the chapel as husband and wife, applause echoed across the estate grounds. Bells rang. Flowers filled the air. Laughter followed them everywhere. Months later, on a warm summer evening, Clara sat beside the lake where she and Nathaniel had once spoken about Eleanor. The water reflected gold from the setting sun. Nathaniel joined her carrying 2 cups of tea. You disappeared. Clara accepted a cup. I wanted to think. Dangerous hobby. I learned it from you. Nathaniel sat beside her. Comfortable silence settled between them. The best kind. After a while Clara spoke. Do you ever miss her? Nathaniel looked across the water. He knew exactly whom she meant. Every day. Clara slipped her hand into his. Nathaniel smiled. But it no longer feels like I am carrying the grief alone. Clara rested her head lightly against his shoulder. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from the house. Home. Family. Life continuing. Nathaniel looked toward the horizon. 8 years of loneliness had convinced him happiness belonged to other people. 8 years of guilt had convinced him healing was impossible. Then a blind seamstress from Yorkshire had touched the scar he spent years hiding from the world. And somehow, without ever seeing it, she had found the wound beneath it. More importantly, she had helped it heal. As the sun disappeared beyond the estate and twilight settled softly over Raven-shire Hall, the Duke who had once refused every future offered to him sat beside the only woman he had ever truly chosen. And for the first time in many years, the future felt brighter than the past.